In the quiet, affluent neighborhood of Brooklyn's Boerum Hill, an unassuming brownstone stands among rows of historic homes. It was once the residence of Heath Ledger, the late Australian actor whose tragic passing in 2008 left Hollywood and his fans reeling. For years after his death, the home remained a solemn landmark, a place of whispered rumors and eerie silence. But when a young couple, Matthew and Olivia Carter, purchased the property in 2023, they had no idea what they were walking into. The Carters, originally from Chicago, had been searching for a home in Brooklyn that combined history with charm. When they came across the brownstone on Dean Street, they were enamored. The house had been renovated, modernized just enough to feel fresh, but retained its old-world character. Though they were aware of its tragic history, neither of them believed in ghosts. Yet, from the moment they moved in, unsettling things began to happen. At first, it was subtle. The feeling of being watched, doors creaking open on their own, and shadows where there should have been none. Olivia, a freelance journalist, worked from home and often swore she heard footsteps overhead when she was alone. Matthew, a software developer, dismissed it as the house settling until one night, the whispering began. It started as a faint murmur, just beyond the edge of comprehension. At first, Olivia thought it was coming from outside, but as she lay awake listening, she realized the sound was inside the house. A low, hushed voice, speaking in an Australian accent. She nudged Matthew awake. "Do you hear that?" "What?" he mumbled, still half asleep. "That voice." Then, as if responding to her, the whispering stopped. The silence was worse. The next morning, Olivia searched online for stories about the house. She found old interviews where friends of Ledger described his struggles with insomnia, how he would stay up late reading scripts or writing in his journals. It gave her a chill. Was that what she had heard? A restless spirit, unable to sleep even in death? One evening, while brushing his teeth, Matthew saw something that made his blood run cold. In the mirror behind him, just for a split second, there was a reflection that wasn't his. It was a man unkempt, with deep, weary eyes staring right at him. He spun around. "Nothing. Liv, we need to talk," he said, his voice shaking. They sat at the kitchen table, recounting every strange thing that had happened. The whispers, the shadows, the reflection. The house, it seemed, was not empty. Determined to get answers, Olivia reached out to a local paranormal investigator. The team arrived with their equipment: EMF detectors, digital recorders, infrared cameras. That night, they conducted a séance. The air felt thick, charged with something unseen. As they asked questions, the temperature dropped, and a faint knock echoed through the room. Then, through the spirit box, a device said to allow spirits to communicate, came a single word: pills. Everyone went silent. Heath Ledger's death had been ruled an accidental overdose. "Do you need help?" Olivia asked, her hands trembling. Another knock, and then so faint it was almost lost in the static, a whisper. "I didn't mean to." After that night, the activity in the house didn't stop, but it changed. The whispers weren't just random murmurs but felt purposeful. Objects still moved on their own, but never violently. It was as if Ledger's spirit wasn't trying to haunt them just to be heard. Matthew and Olivia never felt threatened, only unsettled. They chose to stay, believing the house carried a memory too strong to fade. To this day, guests sometimes report hearing the faint shuffle of footsteps in the halls, the sound of pages turning late at night, and, on rare occasions, a quiet whisper with an unmistakable Australian accent. As if a man, lost between worlds, was still trying to tell his story. The brownstone on Dean Street sat quietly beneath the Brooklyn sky, its facade untouched by time. The seasons changed around it: snow gathering in thick silence on the iron railings in winter, wisteria curling lazily over the stoop in spring, but the house itself remained frozen in something older, something neither past nor present. For Olivia and Matthew Carter, the walls had begun to hum with an energy they could neither explain nor ignore. At first, Olivia found herself drawn to the study on the second floor, the room where Ledger had once spent his restless nights. It was a space that carried a peculiar stillness, as though time had been caught mid-motion and held in place. The light from the street lamp outside spilled through the curtains in fractured golden lines, tracing the edges of old wooden shelves and the deep green walls that seemed to absorb sound. She liked to sit in the worn leather chair by the window, her fingers resting on the armrest, feeling the faintest indentation as if someone else had sat there before her, for long hours lost in thought. She was never alone in that room. Not entirely. It wasn't fear that settled in her chest when she sat there, nor was it comfort. It was something more elusive, something between presence and memory, like the feeling of walking into a room and forgetting why you came. It was the scent, too faint, but unmistakable. A hint of cigarettes, a trace of something musky and warm, like old books and leather and the lingering shadow of a person who had just left. She never mentioned it to Matthew, not at first. He had begun avoiding that part of the house entirely. At night, the whispers returned. Not loud, not words, just the cadence of them, the unmistakable rise and fall of a voice speaking just out of reach. Sometimes, Olivia swore she heard pages turning, the rustle of paper carried through the stillness of the house. Other times, it was the sound of movement, soft but deliberate, as if someone were pacing just beyond the edge of her perception. One evening, as she sat on the couch with a book in her lap, she heard it clearly for the first time. A breath. It was not her own. She lifted her head slowly, pulse quickening, her fingers tightening around the book's spine. The sound had come from the study upstairs. A sigh, quiet, tired, like someone sitting heavily into a chair after a long day. Her instinct was to call for Matthew, but something stopped her. Instead, she rose carefully, the wooden floor cool beneath her bare feet as she moved toward the staircase. Each step groaned under her weight, the house shifting, exhaling, as if aware of her movement. The study door was ajar. Olivia hesitated, her breath shallow, fingers hovering over the handle. She pushed it open. The room was empty. The chair by the window faced outward, as it always did, but the light in the room had changed. It flickered strangely, as though the street lamp outside had dimmed, casting shadows that didn't belong. The air was thick, heavy with something unspoken, something unresolved. And then, just as she was about to step back, the whisper came again, impossibly close, brushing against her ear like a breath against skin. Not yet. Olivia stumbled backward, her heart hammering, the sound of her own pulse roaring in her ears. She turned, fleeing down the stairs, the sensation of something unseen brushing the back of her neck lingering long after she was safely in Matthew's arms. After that night, the air in the house changed. It no longer felt like the quiet, empty brownstone they had moved into. It had weight now, as though the walls had absorbed too much sorrow, too many sleepless nights. The sounds became more frequent, not just whispers, but footsteps, soft and deliberate, pacing the upper floors when no one was there. The scent of cigarettes grew stronger, wafting through rooms in brief, unexplainable bursts. Then, there were the reflections. Matthew was the first to see it again. In the bathroom mirror, just as before. A figure behind him, just out of focus, standing near the doorway. The same weary eyes, the same unkempt hair. But this time, the expression was different. The face wasn't just watching, it was searching. And then it was gone. He refused to tell Olivia at first. He didn't want to feed into whatever was happening, didn't want to let fear take root. But fear was already there. It had settled in the walls, woven itself into the fabric of the house, and neither of them could deny it anymore. The house was waiting for what they didn't yet know. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The house did not sleep. Even when the city settled into the deep lull of night, when the hum of distant traffic faded and Brooklyn lay wrapped in silence, something within the brownstone on Dean Street remained restless. It stirred in the dark corners of the rooms, in the cool draft that moved without reason, in the barely perceptible shifts in shadow. Olivia felt it most in the early hours before dawn, in the time between dreams and wakefulness when the mind is most vulnerable. She would lie in bed, her body wrapped in stillness, while her senses prickled with awareness. It was always the same. A feeling that someone was there, close enough that if she turned her head, She might catch the shape of them in the dimness. She never turned. Not anymore. One night it happened again. The clock on the bedside table read 3:12 a.m. when Olivia woke, her throat dry, her pulse steady but alert. The air in the bedroom was dense, thick with the scent of something familiar yet foreign. A whisper of cologne, a trace of warmth where there should have been cold. And then, the bed dipped. Not much, just the faintest pressure, the kind that would be imperceptible if she hadn't been so still, so attuned to every unnatural movement in the house. It was as if someone had sat down at the edge of the mattress, just beside her feet. Her breath caught. She wanted to move, to wake Matthew, but fear locked her in place, tightening around her limbs like invisible hands. She squeezed her eyes shut, heart pounding in her ribs, her fingers curling into the sheets. And then, close to her ear, so soft it barely disrupted the air. Liv. Her name. Spoken not by Matthew. Not by anyone she could see. The voice was unmistakably male, low and hushed, carrying the slight rasp of exhaustion, of someone who had spent too many nights awake. It was not angry, not threatening, just there. Real. Olivia gasped, her body jerking upright. The air shifted around her, the invisible weight lifting from the bed, as if someone had just risen, just stepped away into the darkness. She turned the lamp on. The golden light spilled across the room, chasing the shadows into corners, revealing nothing but the hollow stillness of an empty space. Matthew stirred beside her. What's wrong? His voice was heavy with sleep, groggy and distant. She opened her mouth, ready to tell him. But what could she say? That a ghost had just whispered her name? That it hadn't felt like a nightmare, but something more tangible, more insistent? Instead, she swallowed. Nothing. I just had a bad dream. A lie, but one that felt safer than the truth. The next day, Olivia couldn't shake the sensation that the house was watching her. She moved through the rooms slowly, feeling the weight of the past pressing in on her. The study was the worst. She hadn't gone inside since the night she had heard the whisper, but something drew her to it now, an invisible pull, as if the house itself was asking her to listen. The door creaked as she pushed it open. Dust particles swirled in the slant of afternoon sunlight, catching the air like tiny ghosts. She stepped inside, her bare feet brushing against the hardwood. The chair by the window faced outward, just as it always did. But something was different. The desk. She was sure she had left it bare, yet now, sitting in the center, was a single object. A notebook. It wasn't hers. Slowly, she moved closer, her fingertips hovering above the worn leather cover before finally pressing down. The surface was cool, the edges slightly frayed. With a deep breath, she flipped it open. The pages were yellowed, filled with slanted handwriting that was both rushed and meticulous, as if the words had poured out in sleepless urgency. Olivia's throat tightened as she read the first line. I don't know how to sleep anymore. Everything feels like a dream. Her pulse quickened. She turned another page. I keep hearing voices in this house. Or maybe they're just in my head. Another page. I don't want to disappear. The words were smudged in places, as if someone had pressed their hand against them, distorting the ink. There were sketches, 2 rough pencil drawings of a face she recognized. Deep eyes, tired but expressive. A reflection of the man who had once lived here. A man who had never truly left. That night, Olivia couldn't sleep. She lay awake beside Matthew, the notebook resting on the nightstand, its presence heavy against the quiet. The words inside lingered in her mind, refusing to fade. I don't want to disappear. Had he known? Had he sensed something in the house? Some lingering presence that had remained even after he was gone? Or worse, was that presence him? As she closed her eyes, exhaustion finally pulling her under, a sound filled the room. Soft, gentle, the unmistakable turn of a page. Even in death, he was still reading. The brownstone had grown heavier, its walls thick with something unseen yet undeniable. It was in the way the air hung, dense and unmoving, pressing against Olivia's skin like static before a storm. It was in the way shadows stretched longer than they should, bending unnaturally along the wooden floorboards, curling in the corners of rooms like forgotten thoughts. It was in the way she no longer felt alone, even when she was. She had started hearing the pages turn at night, always just as sleep began to claim her. The faintest rustling sound, deliberate, rhythmic. Someone reading. Someone still searching for meaning in the lines of a story unfinished. And the worst part? She had stopped fearing it. The notebook remained on the nightstand, but Olivia hadn't opened it again. Not because she didn't want to, because she was afraid of what more she might find. The words had been raw, almost painful to read. There was a loneliness in them, one that clung to the pages like fingerprints, as if Ledger had poured his exhaustion directly into the ink. She could picture him hunched over the desk, scribbling in the dim glow of a single lamp, shadows pooling under his eyes. He had been awake here, in this very house, a prisoner of his own mind, and now perhaps of something else. Matthew had begun noticing the changes in Olivia. She was quieter, distracted. Her fingers twitched absently at the hem of her sweater when she sat on the couch, her eyes distant, lost in thoughts she wouldn't share. "You've barely spoken all day," he said one evening, setting his glass of water on the kitchen counter. "Are you okay?" She hesitated. "I'm fine." It wasn't a lie. Not exactly. But how could she explain the way the house was pulling at her? How could she tell him that she felt as if she were slipping into something deeper, something that had existed before her, something that refused to let go? Instead, she sighed and leaned against the counter, forcing a small smile. "I think I just need some fresh air." Matthew studied her for a moment, his brow furrowed. "You sure that's all?" Olivia nodded, though even she wasn't convinced. That night, as she lay in bed, sleep drifting just beyond reach, the scent of cigarettes curled through the room again, faint, almost imperceptible, but there. She turned onto her side, exhaling slowly. "Who are you?" she whispered into the dark. For a long time there was only silence, and then so soft it could have been imagined. Still here, morning light spilled through the sheer curtains, casting a pale golden glow across the bedroom. Matthew had already left for work, his side of the bed cool, but Olivia remained tangled in the sheets, reluctant to face the day. When she finally rose, she moved slowly, her limbs heavy, as if the night itself had left a residue on her skin. She made her way to the bathroom, rubbing at her tired eyes, and turned on the sink, letting the water run cold before splashing her face. She looked up and froze. The mirror reflected the bathroom behind her, the tiled walls, the fogged glass shower door, but there was something else. A figure, not clear, a silhouette, standing just beyond the threshold, in the hallway. Her breath hitched. Her body went rigid, the pulse in her throat hammering against her skin. She wanted to turn around, to confirm what her mind was struggling to process, but she couldn't. She could only watch. The figure didn't move, didn't shift. It simply stood there, and then slowly, carefully it took a step forward. Olivia gasped, spinning around so fast she nearly lost her balance. The hallway was empty. The air was still. But the mirror told a different story. Because even though the figure was gone, the faintest outline of a handprint remained on the glass, just beside her own reflection. As if someone had reached out. As if someone had tried to touch her. As if someone was trying to remember what it felt like to be real. From that moment on, Olivia knew there was no pretending, no denying what she had seen. The house was no longer just whispering, no longer just hinting at its secrets. It was showing itself to her, piece by piece, memory by memory. Ledger's presence was not a fleeting thing, not a lingering impression that would fade with time. It was something else, something that refused to be forgotten. And deep down, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just haunting them. It was waiting for what she didn't yet know. The house no longer held its secrets in whispers. It had opened itself to Olivia completely, revealing fragments of the past like unfinished sentences, lingering in the air, in the mirrors, in the weight of unseen eyes watching from the dark. The figure in the mirror had not returned, but the presence remained. She could feel it more clearly now, him, not a shadow of malice, but of sorrow, of something unresolved. Ledger had never left. He was still searching, still trapped between memory and oblivion, his presence woven into the fabric of the house. One night, unable to ignore it any longer, Olivia returned to the study, the notebook clutched in her hands. She sat in the worn leather chair by the window, the city humming softly beyond the glass, and whispered into the silence. "What do you need?" For a long moment, nothing happened. Then just the faintest shift in the air. The pages of the notebook fluttered, moved by a breath that was not her own. The scent of cigarettes curled around her, the presence growing heavier, closer. And then, a whisper, clearer than ever before. "Let me go." The words sent a chill through her bones, not from fear, but from understanding. He wasn't haunting the house. The house was holding him. Something in its walls, in its history, had tethered him here, keeping him from fading completely. Maybe it was his own restlessness, his unfinished thoughts. Maybe it was the way the world still spoke of him in half-tragic reverence, keeping his memory alive even when he longed for peace. Olivia exhaled and pressed her palm against the desk. "You don't have to stay," she whispered. The air shifted again, lighter this time, almost weightless. The scent faded. The quiet stretched long and deep. And then nothing. No whispers. No pages turning. No lingering presence. Just stillness. The next morning, Olivia woke feeling lighter than she had in weeks. The house was quiet, not the uneasy, expectant silence that had filled it before, but something softer. Empty, but in a way that felt right. She turned to Matthew, who was already awake, watching her carefully. "Did you feel that?" he asked. She nodded. "He's gone." Matthew didn't question it. He only reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. For the first time since they moved in, the house finally felt like their own. And Heath Ledger, who had spent his final days searching for rest, had finally found it. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.